Imagine a city functioning completely on fumes. You walk outside, and the streets look like a shattered jawbone.
Oh, what a visual.
Right. The infrastructure is just crumbling. There are literal barricades of felled trees still blocking the roads, and the buildings around you look like charred carapaces.
And hollowed out.
Exactly. You've got World War I bleeding the population dry, a violent political rebellion has just ripped through the center of town, and now, to top it all off, a virus so deadly has arrived that people are literally dropping dead on the cobblestones.
It's just collapsing right there in the street.
Yeah.
And what does the government do? They print posters blaming you for catching it. Welcome to Dublin, 1918.
It is just an incredibly bleak picture, and I mean, it's the exact historical reality we are immersing ourselves in today.
We are. We're doing a deep dive into this staggering piece of historical fiction. It's Emma Donoghue's novel, The Pull of the Stars. And for everyone listening right now, before we even touch the story itself, there is a piece of context about this book that is going to, make the hair on your arm stand up. Oh, the timeline of when she wrote it.
Yes. Donoghue actually started writing this novel, which is entirely about the devastating 1918 influenza pandemic. By the way, she started it back in late 2018. She was inspired by the centenary of the Great Flu.
Right, which means she spent all of 2019 researching overwhelmed hospitals, respiratory failure, and systemic societal collapse.
Yeah.
And she delivered the final polished draft to her publishers in March 2020.
March 2020. Literally the exact moment the modern COVID-19 pandemic was slamming the brakes on the entire globe.
It's completely eerie.
It's as if she was writing a ghost story, and then the ghost just walked into the room right as she typed the end.
It really adds this incredible, almost prophetic weight to the narrative. And so our mission for this deep dive is to extract the visceral, the historical, and the deeply human realities of surviving a pandemic in 1918. We're going to explore how Donoghue masterfully synthesizes medical history, the political turmoil of early 20th century Ireland, and unexpected, profound human connection. And, she does all of this within a story that spans a mere 3 days.
3 days. That's it. Just 72 hours. But, well, as we know from our own recent history, when a crisis hits that level of velocity, an entire worldview can shift in 3 days.
Oh, easily.
So we need to set the scene for you. We need to really understand the gravity of 1918 Dublin, because this is not the charming, bustling, literary city you might picture.
Far from it. Donoghue paints Dublin not as a functioning European capital, but as a city completely ravaged by compounding traumas.
Yeah.
You really have to layer these disasters to understand the pressure cooker these characters are living in.
Right.
First, you have 4 relentless years of the First World War. This has drained the city of its young men, of course, but it's also drained it of basic materials.
Yeah, the lack of resources is just staggering. I mean, you mentioned the felled trees and barbed wire in the streets. Those are still there from the 1916 Irish Rising because the city literally cannot afford concrete or asphalt to fix the roads.
Wow.
The war effort has just consumed everything.
Precisely. The physical and psychological aftermath of the 1916 Rising is still an open wound. The center of the city, especially around the General Post Office, was shelled by a gunboat on the Liffey River.
Right in the middle of the city.
Yeah. So you have a civilian population living among ruins, dealing with strict military rationing, widespread poverty, and a profound sense of political betrayal. And then onto this hyper-fragile ecosystem, you just drop the Great Flu.
And the details Donoghue uses to bring this to life are chillingly familiar. The public health campaigns, for instance.
Oh, the posters?
Yes. So our guide through this decaying, paranoid world is a woman named Julia Power. She's a nurse. She's turning 30 years old tomorrow.
Yeah.
And she's navigating this massively understaffed, completely overwhelmed hospital system.
Right.
As she's moving through the city, she sees these public health posters plastered on the lampposts. There's one that reads, and I quote, "Cover up each cough or sneeze. Fools and traitors spread disease."
It's rhyming public health advice wrapped in wartime patriotism.
It's so intense.
There's another one she encounters. If in doubt, don't stir out.
Which is basically 1918 for shelter in place. Right?
Exactly.
And Julia herself is carrying so much weight even before she clocks in at the hospital. She lives with her brother, Tim, who is a traumatized veteran recently returned from the war.
Tim is such a crucial anchor for understanding the psychological baseline of this society. He returned from the trenches in Gallipoli and Palestine completely shattered.
He doesn't even speak, does he?
No, he doesn't speak at all. He communicates with Julia by writing in a little notebook. He jumps violently at loud noises, which is a classic symptom of what they called shell shock at the time. And he wears a little touchwood charm around his neck, just for luck. He represents the silent, walking wounded of this era. Julia is his caretaker at home, and then she has to walk out the door and be a caretaker to an entire dying city at work.
Which brings us to the macabre atmosphere of the city streets. Death is so pervasive, so unavoidable, that society has started giving it nicknames just to process it, you know?
Yeah, the euphemisms.
The flu is called the Great Leveler, or the Malady, or my personal favorite for just sheer creeping dread, the Bone Man.
The Bone Man.
Oh.
It's a piece of folklore Julia remembers from her childhood in the country. It's this image of a skeletal rider who keeps his grinning skull tucked under one arm as he rides a horse from one victim's house to the next.
That is terrifying.
It perfectly encapsulates how the people viewed the virus. Random, relentless, and almost supernatural in its speed.
And you see this Bone Man's handiwork the second Julia starts her morning commute. The sensory immersion here is incredible. She cycles through the dark, slick streets, and the air smells like dung and blood from waiting livestock. Yeah, and when she gets on the tram, it smells overwhelmingly of eucalyptus and carbolic soap. People are literally holding soaked handkerchiefs to their faces in terror, just trying to filter the air.
And out the window, she has to dodge these municipal disinfection carts, spraying terry-smelling chemicals directly into the gutters.
It's a full-on nightmare.
But beyond the smells and the sights, what's truly harrowing is the complete breakdown of social norms and, well, basic human empathy. The fear of contagion is just stronger than the instinct to help.
There is this one story that perfectly illustrates that. A junior nurse named Kavanaugh is found standing in a hospital corridor, just completely covered in blood, staring blankly over a corpse.
Oh, this scene.
It's awful. She tells Julia that she was on her way to work and tried to help a man who collapsed in the street. He was black in the face, clawing at his collar, suffocating. He coughed up his lifeblood all over her, and whoever had initially stopped to help her carry the stretcher, they just dropped it and ran away.
They abandoned them right on the street?
Because they realized what he had.
Exactly. The instinct for self-preservation completely overrides societal duty. What's fascinating to observe is how Donoghue demonstrates a society that has become entirely desensitized to trauma. It's a psychological survival mechanism.
Yeah.
You see this most clearly with the hospital orderlies.
Oh, the orderlies are unforgettable. You have this trio of stretcher bearers, Groin, Shaky O'Shea, and Noseless Nichols.
Nichols is a walking testament to the era's medical realities. He wears a thin copper mask to cover what used to be his nose and left cheek, which were blown away in the war.
Wow.
And it's enameled, painted to look unnervingly lifelike, tinted like a shaved jaw, and it even has a real mustache soldered onto the metal.
That is, I mean, it's a grotesque, uncanny valley reminder of the war's physical toll, just walking right down the hospital hallway.
Yeah, and then there's Groin. He's the orderly who was lucky enough to avoid frontline combat, and he has developed this unbelievably morbid coping mechanism.
Oh, he sings, right.
He sings cheerful, upbeat music hall songs while physically carting away dead bodies. He croons, "Goodbye, don't cry," as he wheels corpses down to the mortuary. And he has this endless list of flippant euphemisms for dying. Someone turn up her toes, or hop the twig, or is counting worms.
It's incredibly jarring to hear someone be so casual about mass death.
It is jarring, but well, reflects a society desperately trying to whistle past the graveyard. When death is that ubiquitous, you either break down completely or you trivialize it to rob it of its power.
That makes sense.
You see the exact same phenomenon in the newspapers. Julia glimpses on the tram. They are printing advertisements for Cinnamint, the germicidal throat tablet, and hot lemonade right alongside massive world-altering headlines about naval mutinies against the Kaiser.
Just putting those right next to each other.
Right. It's the mundane commercialization of panic sitting right next to the collapse of empires.
Okay, I have to push back on something here, or at least challenge our modern interpretation of it.
Yeah.
I look at the posters Julia sees, specifically the one that says, "The general weakening of nerve power, known as war weariness, has opened a door to contagion. Defeatists are the allies of disease."
Yes.
My modern brain looks at that and screams, institutional gaslighting, you know? It feels like cynical blame shifting. But to push back on our own modern bias for a second, wasn't there a legitimate, albeit misguided, medical belief at the time that psychology impacted physiology? Like, did the authorities actually believe that low morale suppressed the immune system, or was it purely a political manipulation to keep people fighting the war?
That's a brilliant distinction to draw, and the truth lies somewhere in the murky middle.
Yeah.
Yes, early 20th century medicine did lean heavily into the concept of nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, believing that psychological fortitude was literally a physical barrier against illness.
Okay, so it wasn't just made up.
Right? Some medical professionals likely believed that fear made you vulnerable. However, from a governmental standpoint, the utility of that belief was entirely cynical.
Because if catching a horrific respiratory virus is framed as a failure of willpower, a sign of defeatism, then the government isn't at fault for failing to provide adequate medical care, sanitation, or safe working conditions.
Exactly. It attempts to maintain wartime morale. You must stay strong for the boys at the front, while completely absolving the state of his public health failures. Hearses are lined up outside the undertakers before dawn, people are dropping on the cobblestones, and the official stance is essentially, we just didn't have enough positive energy.
It's the 1918 version of toxic positivity, completely weaponized by the state. And this macro-level societal breakdown, the lack of supplies, the failing infrastructure, the government shifting blame, it acts like a physical pressure that forces the hospital to improvise.
It does.
It pushes Julia off her regular, orderly surgical ward and down into this terrifying, claustrophobic microcosm where the entire story unfolds.
The maternity fever ward.
If you can even call it a ward, it's a cramped supply closet.
Literally a closet.
Yeah. They've hastily converted it because they realized pregnant women were catching the flu at alarming rates, and they needed somewhere to isolate them. They just crammed 3 metal cots into this tiny room. There's a sink, but no fireplace, so it's freezing. Julia just has to pile blankets on the patients.
This tiny room is the crucible of the entire narrative.
Yeah.
And what Donoghue does so masterfully is explain the horrifying intersection of pregnancy and the 1918 influenza virus. The biology of it is an absolute tragedy.
I was looking into the medical biology behind this, and it's a physiological nightmare. A pregnant woman's body is already working at maximum capacity. Her lungs, her heart, her circulation are all redlined just to support the fetus.
Right.
And more than that, her immune system naturally suppresses itself slightly so her body doesn't attack the foreign DNA of the baby.
Am I right in thinking the virus just exploits that exact lack of biological bandwidth? You are exactly right. As Julia and a doctor discuss in the hospital, the maternal body is, as they put it, gearing up for war to grow this new life. Their defenses are stretched incredibly thin. Furthermore, as the fetus grows, it literally compresses the mother's lungs, reducing her lung capacity.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the physical space.
Yeah, so when this incredibly aggressive respiratory strain of flu hits, it finds the perfect victim. The virus attacks the compromised lungs, causing rocketing fevers, and those high fevers frequently induce sudden, violent miscarriages, premature labor, or acute maternal death. It's a perfect biological storm.
And Julia is essentially alone in this freezing closet with 3 women who represent entirely different facets of Dublin society. It's a brilliant cross-section. First, we have Ida Noonan.
Ida is a heartbreaking figure. She's from the deep slums of the city. She is only 33 years old, but she is on her 12th pregnancy.
12 pregnancies by 33? That physiological toll alone is staggering.
And she already has 7 living children at home. When Julia meets her, Ida is deeply delirious with a high fever, which is a severe complication of the flu. Her skin is fiery red, and she's hallucinating, muttering about her husband pushing a barrel organ around town.
Yeah.
She is the embodiment of the city's grinding poverty.
Julia is fighting 20th century biology with 19th century tools. She's using mustard poultices, trying to draw the heat out, giving Ida drops of whiskey and hot water to stimulate her heart. It's useless. Ida suddenly goes into massive convulsions. It happens with terrifying speed.
That's gas.
She thrashes violently against the wooden skirting board of the room, and she dies right there on the floor.
The sheer velocity of the disease is what makes it so terrifying.
But here is the detail that absolutely floored me. When they do the post-mortem autopsy on Ida later, they find a perfectly healthy baby boy inside her. The flu didn't touch the baby at all. The virus just completely destroyed the environment the baby needed to survive. The mother suffocated, so the baby suffocated.
It's a stark, brutal demonstration of the bone man's power. The virus doesn't negotiate. Then, in the bed right next to where Lita just died, you have Delia Garrett. She represents a completely different world.
Yes, Delia is a wealthy Protestant woman. She's 20 years old, having her 3rd child. She arrived at the hospital wearing a ribbon hat and fine gloves.
Quite the contrast.
Definitely. She was fully expecting to give birth in a luxurious, private nursing home, but the flu wiped out the staff there, so she's been dumped into this public hospital closet.
Delia is terrified. And because of her class background, she is incredibly demanding. She complains about the noise, the smells, the proximity to the other patients. But as the narrative makes clear, her wealth and status offers zero biological protection against the virus. She catches the fever, and she goes into premature labor.
And the clinical detail Donoghue provides for the sequence is agonizing. Julia has to administer chloroform while Delia pushes. And for anyone listening who isn't familiar with early anesthesia, this isn't an epidural.
Not at all.
Julia is dripping toxic liquid onto a cloth over Delia's face, trying to ride the razor's edge between numbing the pain and accidentally stopping the mother's heart. And the result of the labor is devastating.
It's a stillbirth. A little girl.
Julia checks for a heartbeat with this primitive wooden ear trumpet. She slaps the baby's back, clears the airway, but there's nothing. And as if the psychological trauma of losing the baby isn't enough, Delia then suffers a severe hemorrhage. The placenta doesn't detach properly from the uterine wall.
And here we see the brutal, tactile reality of 1918 medicine. There are no advanced surgical suites. Julia has to put on boiled, thick rubber gloves, reach inside Delia's uterus, and manually detach the placenta.
The margin for error there is zero. One slip of a boiled rubber glove, one microscopic tear, and she either bleeds out on the cot or dies of sepsis 3 days later. Julia describes the sensation as raking the strings and peeling the awful fruit with her awkward gloved hands, literally begging the tissue to release its grip. It is an incredibly intense, visceral scene.
It really demands the reader acknowledge the sheer physical labor of early nursing. And while Julia is managing this hemorrhage, there's the third patient in the room, Mary O'Reilly.
Mary is just 17 years old. It's her first pregnancy. She's sweet, she's meek, and she is enduring days of obstructed labor. The contractions are agonizing, but the baby just will not descend into the birth canal.
And there's a much darker undercurrent to Mary's story. She's terrified of her own body. She literally asks Julia if her navel is going to open up to let the baby out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which highlights the complete lack of basic anatomical education for women at the time. But more sinisterly, she's hiding the fact that her husband is physically abusive. She has claw marks on her belly from the stretching skin, but later Julia spots deliberate, violent bruising on her wrists.
So just to recap the nightmare, Julia's managing a woman thrashing to death from fever convulsions, a wealthy woman hemorrhaging from a stillbirth, and a 17-year-old abuse victim paralyzed by obstructed labor, essentially alone in a closet with some hot water and whiskey.
It's overwhelming.
And I have to point out the dark visual irony Donoghue sets up here. When Julia arrives at the hospital that morning, she looks up at the grand wrought iron gates. The hospital's Latin motto is forged into the metal: Vita gloriosa vita, life, glorious life.
Right.
But Donoghue specifically notes that the letters are tipped with thick black soot from the city's coal fires. It's this beautiful, grand ideal, completely covered in the grime and death of reality.
That soot is the perfect metaphor for the reality inside the walls. Julia is fighting the soot in the pandemic, and she is losing. But the tide in this makeshift ward doesn't turn with better medicine or a new shipment of supplies. It turns with radical politics. Help finally arrives, and it walks through the door in the form of Dr. Kathleen Lynn.
Okay, we need to talk about Dr. Kathleen Lynn. And it's important to know for you listening, Dr. Lynn is the only real historical figure in this entire novel. Everyone else is a fictionalized composite, but she was a real, deeply influential person.
And what a disruptive force she is. Dr. Lynn is a revelation when she walks into the ward. First of all, she is a female doctor, which was incredibly rare and hard-won at the time. But secondly, and more dangerously, she is a prominent Sinn Féin rebel.
And she is currently on the run from the police. She is a fugitive practicing medicine.
Exactly. Now, to impartially report on the political tensions depicted in the book, because Donoghue lays them out very clearly without necessarily taking sides, there is a sharp, bitter divide in how the Irish population viewed the 1916 Rising and the ongoing First World War.
Right. Julia, our protagonist, is initially very hostile toward the rebels, and her perspective is deeply personal, not just ideological. Her brother Tim enlisted in the British Army, fought in Gallipoli, and came home a shell of a human being.
Which informs everything she believes.
Absolutely. To Julia, the rebels who started a violent uprising in Dublin right in the middle of a world war are traitors. She says the gunfire in the streets didn't bring Irish home rule an inch closer. It just gave people a reason to hate those who shed blood in their names. To her, they just added to the body count.
That is Julia's lived traumatic experience. On the other hand, we get Dr. Lynn's perspective. Dr. Lynn tells Julia that she initially took up the cause of women's suffrage and the labor movement, hoping for a peaceful democratic transition to a self-governing Ireland.
Right.
But she argues that the British government was never going to actually grant home rule. They were just going to keep fobbing them off with empty promises while extracting Irish resources.
Dr. Lynn points out that thousands of Irishmen, exactly like Tim, have sacrificed their bodies and minds in the cause of empire and capital, dying in foreign trenches for a king that doesn't care about them. But for Dr. Lynn, the true war crimes aren't just happening on the battlefield in Europe, they are happening in the slums of Dublin.
This is where Dr. Lynn's politics and her medical practice fuse perfectly. She tells Julia that the infant mortality rate in Dublin is 15%.
Wait, 15%?
15% of babies die. She attributes this directly to the damp, crowded, horrific housing conditions forced upon the Irish poor, the tenement system. She calls the government's approach hypocritical. They preach hygiene and nerve power to people who are forced to live like rats in a sack, completely undefended against dysentery, tuberculosis, and syphilis.
For Dr. Lynn, medicine and political rebellion are two sides of the exact same coin. She told Julia, "We all do our bit to increase the sum of human knowledge." She is fighting, both medically and politically, for a society that treats its children kindly. She wants a republic that cherishes all the children of the nation equally. She doesn't see a difference between fighting the British Empire and fighting the influenza virus. They are both systems that destroy the poor.
And you see her radical, unyielding nature in action when the real world intrudes on the ward. Two officers from the Dublin Metropolitan Police barge right into the hospital. They have a warrant for her arrest under the Defence of the Realm Act.
And the Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA, was this incredibly sweeping wartime legislation that basically allowed the government to arrest anyone for almost anything deemed a threat to the war effort. They accuse her of war crimes related to a supposed German plot.
They track her down to the hospital and try to drag her out.
And this scene is amazing because of Julia's transformation. Julia, who just pages ago was mentally calling the rebels terrorists and deeply resenting Dr. Lynn's politics, suddenly steps up. She realizes she desperately needs this doctor to save her patients.
She needs her there.
Yeah. So when the police barge in, Julia boldly lies to their faces. She stands in front of them, points at an empty baby crib, and tells them they're in a women's lying-in ward. She effectively shames these men for intruding on such a sacred, private, exclusively female space. The police get flustered, embarrassed, and they retreat to wait in the hall.
It's a brilliant character moment. It shows Julia prioritizing the immediate practical need of her patients over her abstract political allegiances. She secures the doctor's help, and Dr. Lynn immediately gets to work, diagnosing, strategizing, and eventually even performing a makeshift autopsy on Ida Noonan to learn more about how the disease attacks the lungs.
So Dr. Lynn is handling the high-level medical strategy and the political philosophy. But the emotional heart of this story, the absolute core of what Donoghue is trying to say about human connection, arrives in the form of an untrained, impoverished young girl.
Bridie Sweeney.
Bridie Sweeney. Let's talk about Bridie. She walks into this freezing, bloody closet wearing street clothes. Her hair is this frizzy bronze halo, and her hands are red and swollen with chilblains from the cold. She's about 22 years old, and she introduces herself cheerfully, simply as a volunteer sent by the hospital matron to lend a hand.
But as Donoghue peels back the layers of her character, Bridie's background is revealed to be unbelievably dark. She comes from a Catholic mother and baby home. In the novel, Bridie refers to this institution simply and chillingly as the pipe.
The pipe. For anyone listening who thinks of systemic, institutional exploitation as a modern corporate concept, this is the 1918 version. It is an invisible plumbing system designed to take society's mistakes and convert them into free labor. Can you explain the economics of these mother and baby homes? Because it's a brutal loop.
It is a brutally efficient, circular logic of systemic exploitation. Unwed pregnant women who get into trouble are sent to these convents to give birth in secret, hidden away to protect their families' respectable reputations. But they aren't just given charitable shelter. They incur a financial debt for their stay.
Right, they have to pay it back.
Exactly. To pay off that debt, They are forced to stay for a year or more as unpaid labor scrubbing floors, doing commercial laundry, minding other children.
They literally generate capital for the institution through their shame. And what happens to the babies once the mothers leave?
That's the darkest part of the system. Many women leave after their year of servitude, desperate to escape the stigma and return to society, and they leave the children behind. Those orphaned or abandoned children, like Bridie, are raised entirely within the institution.
Oh, wow.
They become the next generation of unpaid labor. They are, for all intents and purposes, institutional slaves. Bridie doesn't even know her own real birthday. She has grown up in a world of strict physical punishment, constant grueling work, and absolute emotional deprivation.
It's a literal pipe. You flush unwanted people down, and they just cycle through the dark indefinitely. And here's my question for you, considering that horrific environment. How on earth can someone who has experienced zero love, zero affection in her entire 22 years of life be so naturally, instinctually good at giving it to these terrified mothers in the ward?
That is the profound psychological mystery of Bridie Sweeney. By all metrics of developmental psychology, she should be hardened, bitter, or completely detached. But despite being raised in a punitive, loveless environment, she hasn't been corrupted by it. Instead, she possesses this radical, instinctive empathy.
Yeah.
When Delia Garrett is sobbing hysterically over her stillborn baby, it's Bridie, who has never known a mother's comfort herself, who immediately goes to her, strokes Delia's hair, and shushes her gently like a child.
She just has this incredible zest for life that the institution couldn't beat out of her. She is in absolute awe of the most basic things. When Mary Raleigh's baby kicks against the womb, Bridie is astounded. She thought babies only came to life after they were actually born because she's never been taught basic biology.
Which makes sense given her background.
Yeah. She's mesmerized by Julia's silver pocket watch, calling it magic, because she's never owned a single valuable possession. And she tells Julia she's only been to the cinema exactly once in her entire life. She snuck in the side door while running an errand and saw a Mary Pickford silent film called Hearts Adrift.
The contrast between Bridie's deeply tragic past and her radiant, unbroken spirit in the present is the emotional engine of the narrative. She steps into this room, steeped in blood and fear, and she immediately starts bringing light. She runs errands tirelessly, she holds hands, she cleans gore without flinching, and she looks at Julia with this absolute open-hearted worship.
Which leads us to the emotional climax of the novel, the moment that gives the book its title. It happens away from the blood and the screaming, up on the roof of the hospital.
Yes, the concept of influenza del Stel.
Right. Before the roof scene, Dr. Lynn shares a piece of historical trivia with Julia. She explains the etymology, the actual origin of the word influenza.
She tells Julia that the word comes from medieval Italian influenza delle stelle. It translates to the influence of the stars. The Italians in the Middle Ages believed that sudden, widespread sickness wasn't caused by germs, but by the heavens governing human fates.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they believed the stars were pulling on human beings with invisible strings. They believed people were, quite literally, star-crossed.
We could always blame the stars, Dr. Lynn says. It's this idea that fate is just yanking us around for its obscure amusement. And with that heavy philosophical concept hanging in the air, Julia and Bridie managed to sneak up to the hospital roof for a few minutes of fresh air during a grueling night shift.
It's a beautifully quiet scene. They are physically elevated above the soot, the sirens, and the dying city. They share a single chocolate truffle, which Bridie eats with her eyes closed, as if it's a condemned man's last meal, savoring every molecule, and they look up at the night sky.
Julia teaches Bridie about the cosmos. She tells her that Jupiter has multiple moons, not just one. It completely blows Bridie's mind to realize the universe is that vast. And then Julia reveals something deeply personal. She shows Bridie her silver pocket watch.
This is a fascinating exploration of the psychology of grief and how we memorialize the dead when the system refuses to do so. Julia shows Bridie the back of her watch, and it is covered in tiny, deliberate scratches.
A map of the dead.
Yes. She explains that for every patient she loses, she takes a pen and gouges a mark into the silver casing. Full moons for the mothers who die. Crescent moons or broken lines for the babies lost before or during birth.
Bridie looks at it and calls it a map of the dead. Julia says she feels these lost lives demand to be recorded somewhere permanent. The hospital will just file away a death certificate, but Julia needs a physical weight to their memory. It's a personal rebellion against the anonymity of the bone man. She is etching their existence into time itself.
And it raises a profound question that Donoghue weaves throughout the novel. Does fate control us, as the concept of influenza delle stelle suggests? Are we just puppets dancing to the gravitational pull of a virus, of poverty, of war? Or do human beings have the agency to write their own destinies, to defy the stars?
Up on that roof, Julia makes a choice that completely defies the rigid rules of her society, her Catholic upbringing, and her profession. She is a 30-year-old spinster nurse living a strict, dutiful, constrained life. But in this quiet, revolutionary moment, looking at this incredibly brave girl from the pipe, Julia leans in and kisses Bridie.
It is a moment of profound, fierce connection forged in the absolute fires of a global catastrophe. Donoghue is showing us that when the old world is dying on its feet, a new one struggles to be born in the ashes. They find warmth and genuine love in a world that is actively, systematically trying to freeze them out.
But the stars are always pulling, aren't they? Fate has its strings. The tragic twist of the novel arrives with absolute whiplash speed. The very next day, Bridie is working on the ward, full of energy, glowing from the connection she's made. She sneezes, and within a matter of hours, she collapses.
The flu takes her. And what Donoghue emphasizes here is the terrifying speed of the 1918 strain. It wasn't a lingering illness, it was an ambush. Her temperature skyrockets to 104 degrees. The cyanosis sets in.
That's the blue scan, right?
Yes, this is when the lungs fail to oxygenate the blood and the patient's face literally turns blue or purple.
Julia is frantic. She tries everything, the poultices, the whiskey, the blankets. But Dr. Lynn's words from earlier echo in the room. The virus isn't evil, it isn't malicious. It's just a blind, reproducing entity with no mercy and no moral compass.
It doesn't care.
It doesn't care that Bridie has never had a fair life, that she just experienced her first real kiss, that she's purely good. The bone man takes her anyway. Bridie dies on a makeshift metal cot in the very closet where she had brought so much comfort to others.
Bridie's sudden death absolutely shatters Julia. She loves standing over the body of a girl she had just begun to imagine a future with, covered in her blood. But crucially, while it breaks her heart, it also crystallizes her resolve. It hardens her. Because while she is mourning Bridie, the final crisis of the novel is unfolding in the bed right next to them.
The universe doesn't give her a second to grieve. Which brings us to the climax of the story, defying the stars. Let's talk about the final patient, Honor White.
Honor White is admitted to the ward in the final hours. She is an unwed mother, deeply religious specifically. She's a pioneer, which means she refuses even medicinal alcohol, and she has been sent to the hospital directly from the pipe.
The exact same institution Bridie grew up in.
Exactly. Honor's labor is an absolute nightmare. She's dying of the flu, her lungs are failing, but she refuses any painkillers, even the chloroform, because her religious conditioning has convinced her she must suffer the pain of childbirth as punishment for her sins. The baby is what they call stargazing, born face up instead of face down, which makes the delivery incredibly difficult and dangerous.
Dr. Lynn has to intervene physically. She uses French forceps to forcefully pull the baby out. But the trauma of the birth, combined with the virus, causes Honor to begin hemorrhaging massively. In a desperate, bleeding-edge bid to save her life, Julia attempts a direct arm-to-arm blood transfusion.
Again, the medical history here is fascinating. They didn't have blood banks. Julia knows she is a universal donor, type O, so they literally hook a rubber tube with needles on both ends from Julia's vein directly into Honor's arm. Julia tries to physically pour her own life force into this dying woman.
It's so visceral.
But it fails. The biology of early transfusions was incredibly risky. Even with universal donor blood, the recipient's body can suffer a severe agglutination reaction. Honor's body rejects the blood. She gives birth to a boy, and then she dies on the table.
And we have to look closely at the baby she leaves behind, Barnabas. He is born with a cleft lip, which Donoghue refers to using the old Gaelic term Berna Gioria, or hair's gap.
So we have to analyze the legal and social reality of Barnabas' situation. Honor is dead. The baby is a filius nullius, a Latin legal term meaning nobody's son. He is illegitimate in the eyes of the law and the church. And he has a facial deformity.
Which means his fate is sealed. Sister Luke, who is the rigid, unyielding night nurse belonging to the order of nuns that run the pipe, prepares to take Barnabas back to the institution.
Sister Luke's logic is the cold logic of the system. As a child born out of wedlock with a physical defect in 1918 Catholic Ireland, he's considered unadoptable. He will be at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy in an already brutal system. He will be sent into the pipe, condemned to the exact same life of loveless servitude, abuse, and namelessness that Bridie Sweeney just died escaping.
And this is the ultimate test of Julia's character. Think about what she has endured in these 3 days. She couldn't save Ida Noonan. She couldn't save Delia's baby. She couldn't save Honor. And most devastatingly, she couldn't save Bridie. The stars pulled them all away. But she looks at Barnabas and she refuses to let the system consume another life.
It is a fierce, unyielding act of defiance. Sister Luke literally packs Barnabas into a Gladstone bag, treating him like luggage, and sneaks out of the hospital into the dark Dublin streets to walk him back to the convent.
Julia realizes what's happening and sprints after her. She runs through the crumbling, unlit streets of Dublin, dodging the rubble in the shadows, and physically intercepts the nun. And Julia just verbally eviscerates her.
She lets her have it.
Oh, completely. She screams Bridie Sweeney's name into the night. She confronts Sister Luke with the reality of what the convent does, how they keep slaves, how they brutalize orphans, how they sent an underfed, uneducated girl into a fever ward without a second thought, effectively signing her death warrant.
Sister Luke tries to brush her off, falling back on institutional authority. She calls Julia unhinged, distraught, and hysterical. But Julia is completely clear-eyed. She isn't hysterical, she is resolute. She demands the baby. She says it's a bargain she owes to Bridie. A life for a life.
She steals the baby. She literally takes the Gladstone bag containing Barnabas from the nun's hands, turns her back on the institution, and walks away. She decides, in that moment on the street, that she is going to raise this nobody's son as her own. She walks him through the ruined city, heading back to her small house to raise this child with her traumatized mute brother, Tim.
It's a breathtaking thematic resolution. Donoghue strips away the biological family, the societal structures, and the medical safety nets, and asks, well, what is left?
And what we find in The Pull of the Stars is that in the midst of staggering loss, when a relentless virus is stripping society down to the absolute studs, what remains is the fierce, urgent need to create new families when the old world is dying on its feet. Julia, Tim, and Barnabas. A spinster nurse, a shattered mute soldier, and an orphan baby with a cleft lip. That is the unconventional, fiercely loyal family that survives the end of the world.
It's a powerful synthesis of all the novel's themes. And it leaves us with a final reflection on that core concept, influenza dell'estel. If the stars really do pull on our fates with invisible strings, sending us into the chaotic paths of pandemics, wars, and systemic cruelty, perhaps our only true defense against that pull is the gravity we create between each other. The gravity of a shared chocolate truffle on a roof, the gravity of a stolen kiss, the gravity of choosing to carry another person's burden.
The gravity we create between each other. I love that. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over. Look around at the people in your own life. We've all been through our own versions of systemic shocks recently. How do the crises you've faced, the storms you've weathered, reveal the chosen family you're meant to protect? When the stars pull, who do you hold on to?
It's the only question that matters when the world stops making sense. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you for being here with us. Just remember, while the stars might pull us, it is ultimately up to us to connect the dots.